May I have your attention, please? I have something I think you all ought to know about. It seems that Mrs. Phelps doesn't think too highly of our worth. She put this team together because she thought we'd be bad enough to finish dead last, knocking attendance down to the point where she could move the team to Miami and get rid of all of us for better personnel.
What if we don't finish last?
She'll replace you with somebody who will. After this season, you'll be sent back to the minors or given your outright release.
Let me ask you a question. Can you hit a curveball?
The MLB announced that they will be moving this year's All Star Game and Draft out of Atlanta after Georgia passed new laws on voting restrictions.
Today we are talking more about Major League Baseball and this woke disaster of moving the All Star Game out of Georgia.
You're about inclusion. You say you're about doing the right thing. At some point in time, you have to put those actions into words. Put those words into action. That's what they're doing, Skip.
On Friday, MLB announcing it's moving the Midsummer Classic out of Atlanta.
Absolutely agree. I applaud them. The issue with the voting law, because you're going to hear plenty of spin about it, it's already out there. But actually, it
is red pilling so many people that probably don't pay attention to the woke movement, but now are seeing it, finally seeing it for what it really is.
Think about the money.
ESPN has decided they're going to talk about this over on their YouTube channel. And do you know what happened on all three of those videos? It got ratioed to hell and back.
LeBron James is the one person that's is about the voting. He's about making a difference legislatively in a very conspicuous fashion.
Look at that ratio right there. Over double the dislikes. Here's the Jump talking about it. Look at that ratio right there. Let's go over to PTI. 2,100 down votes to only 800 up votes. ESPN getting destroyed. Every normal thinking person that gets exposed to the woke movement looks at it and says, this is a disaster. What in the world are they thinking? Why is this happening?
On April 2nd, 2021, the organization known as Major League Baseball announced it would be moving the 2021 All Star Game and the first-year player draft from Atlanta, Georgia to Denver, Colorado in response to new voting laws passed by the state of Georgia. MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred released the following statement through the league. Quote, I have decided that the best way to demonstrate our values as a sport is by relocating this year's All-Star Game and MLB Draft. Major League Baseball fundamentally supports voting rights for all Americans and opposes restrictions to the ballot box. We proudly used our platform to encourage baseball fans and communities throughout our country to perform their civic duty and actively participate in the voting process. Fair access to voting continues to have our game's unwavering support. There's a few problems with this statement, and there are more than a few problems with Rob Manfred and Major League Baseball itself, because moving the All-Star Game has nothing to do with Georgia's new voting laws, has nothing to do with racism, and has nothing to do with Manfred's, quote, values as a sport, because there are none. And if there were, they wouldn't be civic duty, active participation, or fair access. Everyone has this story wrong. It is way better and infinitely more insane and infuriating than anyone understands. It is the greatest American crime story of the century, and it begins with baseball.
I guess there's only one thing left to do.
What's that?
Win the whole fucking thing.
Yeah.
Yes!
1860s, aided by soldiers playing the game in camp during the Civil War, New York-style baseball expanded into a national game and spawned baseball's first governing body, the National Association of Baseball Players. By 1867, more than 400 clubs were members. Most of the strongest clubs remain those based in the northeastern United States. For professional baseball's founding year, MLB uses the year 1869, when the first professional team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, was established. In 1876, the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs, later known as the National League or NL, was established. The league placed its emphasis on clubs rather than on players. Clubs could now enforce player contracts, preventing players from jumping to higher-paying clubs. A concerted effort was made to curb gambling on games, which was leaving the validity of results in doubt. So even in the sterilized propaganda lab that is Wikipedia, it is undeniable that from the outset, the quote-unquote major leagues were plagued by corruption, racism, and revisionist history. Quote, around this time, the 1860s, a gentleman's agreement was struck between the clubs to exclude non-white players from professional baseball, a de facto ban that remained in effect until 1947. It is a common misconception that Jackie Robinson was the first African-American major league ball player. He was actually only the first after a long gap and the first in the modern era. Moses Fleetwood Walker and his brother Weldie Walker were unceremoniously dropped from major and minor league rosters in the 1880s, as were other African Americans in baseball. But there is another account of the history of baseball hidden behind a Google warning for dangerous content that dives more deeply into just exactly what baseball is than why it exploded in popularity post-war thanks to media propaganda. It was the media that crowned it the national pastime while simultaneously being whitewashed and segregated. An investigation into why baseball morphed from a racially diverse league of players with love for the game to a perverted, whites-only, ultra-slick New York machine controlled by leftist millionaires and corporations and game-fixing Italian mobsters. And that should sound familiar if you were properly educated, which you weren't, for a reason. Because in New York, and baseball itself, all roads lead back to Tammany Hall. You are now entering dangerous content.
Jobu, ayúdame en este momento para que me des el poder para conquistar el cuerpo. Te daré mi devoción para siempre poderoso.
¿Qué pasa there, Pedro?
Bats. They are sick. I cannot hit curveball. Straight ball, I hit it very much. Curveball, bats are afraid. I asked Jobu to come. Take fear from bats. I offered him cigar and rum. He will come.
In the early days of New York City, baseball and politics were often intertwined in schemes to ensure huge financial gains. Early in the 19th century, athletic clubs formed in America to promote leisure and exercise. Two fraternities were spawned from these clubs, the Sporting Fraternity and an offshoot called the Baseball Fraternity. During the 1830s, amateur town ball clubs were formed, many in the Northeast. A variation on town ball was called the New York Game, and the earliest set of published game rules, the Knickerbocker Rules, was written on September 23, 1845, by William R. Wheaton, a member of the Knickerbocker Club. In the years that followed, the New York Game persisted over other forms of town ball, largely due to the influence of the fast-growing New York press during the middle of the 19th century. These early amateur games were often followed by elaborate parties. But in baseball, an encyclopedia of popular culture, Ed Riley states that as soon as the New York Knickerbockers organized and started competing against other teams, spectators began betting on the outcome. Betting quickly became a problem as the chance to win a wager fostered a desire to limit one's risk by predetermining the outcome. Winning and losing took on a different tone as the stakes literally went up. By the early part of the 1850s, baseball had become increasingly organized. In 1856, the game was christened the national pastime in the New York Mercury, a newspaper of the era. In the year that followed, the amateur baseball clubs banded together to form the National Association of Baseball Players. After the Civil War, the goodwill of the game began to fade as amateur teams focused more and more on winning, and owners sought out the best talent and paid them under the table. Fixing or hippodroming of games fostered predetermined outcomes. In 1860, 1865, the first documented report of baseball corruption appeared. 3 members of the New York City Mutuals, whose leader at that time was William Tweed, conspired with a gambler to throw a game to the Eckfords of Brooklyn. The Society of St. Tammany was initially a fraternal organization run along the lines of a social club, but in the 1830s, the society grew more political in nature. The hall in the name was a reference to the headquarters of the organization. Boss Tweed became the head of the Tammany Hall political machine in 1863. As a member of many boards and commissions, he controlled political patronage in New York City and was able to ensure the loyalty of voters through the jobs he could create and dispense on city-related projects. The powerful cadre that surrounded Tweed was known as the Tweed Ring, and the extent of the corruption fostered by the ring had never been seen in New York City. They controlled elections by bribery and the fraudulent counting of votes, filling elective offices with their cronies. Office seekers could not get elected without Tweed's support. The ring wanted to exercise political power, but they also wanted to enrich themselves at the public expense. One infamous example, in 1858, the city allocated $250,000 to build a new courthouse behind City Hall. Upon completion in 1871, the final tab came to a staggering $12 million, with 75% of that used as graft for fraudulently contracted bills. The courthouse stands today, with a recent complete renovation, as a monument to the corruption that Tammany Hall foisted on New York City. For Tammany, baseball was another avenue of pursuing financial gains. The corruption uncovered in the 1865 Mutuals Eckfords game was merely the tip of the iceberg. Stephen Reese wrote in Touching Base, Professional Baseball and American Culture in the Progressive Era, amateur and professional baseball always had close links to Tammany Hall. Several prominent politicians got their start in politics through Tammany-sponsored baseball teams. The teams provided a means to attract ambitious and athletically inclined young men to politics. By 1869, Tammany was contributing generously to the upkeep of the Mutuals, who were all on salary, making them a truly professional team. When the New York City Council voted the team $1,500 towards a trip to New Orleans in 1869, Tweed countered with $7,500 from his own pocket, another way to secure votes. Interest in professional baseball grew, and the first professional organization, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, aka the National Association, NA, was formed on March 17, 1871 at a meeting in New York City. The league was run by the players, an undisciplined group with little business acumen, and lasted only until 1875. John Thorne in Baseball in the Garden of Eden writes, "The low state of the National Association after the 1875 campaign could be chalked up to rampant corruption and drunkenness, as well as to radically unbalanced competition that permitted Boston to win the championship 4 years running." The National League was formed at a meeting in the Grand Central Hotel on Broadway on February 2, 1876. William Hulbert, a Midwesterner and the self-appointed mastermind behind the transference of the NA to the National League, felt that there was too much corruption in the Eastern teams. Under a ruse to gather representatives from some of the NA clubs, Hulbert claimed that he wanted to discuss some thorny problems that were undermining the game. In 1877, the first major league scandal took place involving 4 ball players from the Louisville Club. Although 2 of the players had previous ties with Tammany, there are no hard facts to suggest that Tammany had played a major role. There were more scandals in the ensuing years, but none necessarily perpetrated by Tammany Hall. Tweed was finally brought into court in January of 1873, but the trial ended with a hung jury. His second trial, later that year, was prosecuted much more diligently, and Tweed's cronies were kept out of the jury pool. Ultimately, as told by Ellis, Tweed was found guilty of 102 offenses and sentenced to 12 years in prison, but served only 1, in living quarters fit for a king. On the day that he was released, he was rearrested on a civil charge and sent to the Ludlow Street Jail, where he lived in a 2-room suite that actually belonged to the warden. Minimum security was the order of the day. Tweed lived the life of Riley. One afternoon in December 1875, accompanied by 2 security guards, Tweed took a carriage ride to his family's brownstone on Madison Avenue. Then, in an elaborate getaway scheme which cost him $60,000, he walked out the back door to a waiting wagon which spirited him to a rowboat on the Hudson River. He hid out in the Palisades for 3 months and was then escorted to Staten Island, where he hopped a schooner to the Everglades in Florida. He was picked up by a fishing boat that took him to Cuba, where he boarded a ship to cross the Atlantic and landed in V Vigo, Spain on September 6, 1876. Unfortunately for Mr. Tweed, he was traced to Spain. Although there were no photographs of Tweed that could identify him, the Spanish authorities amazingly recognized Tweed from a Thomas Nast caricature and turned him over to the American authorities. Once back in the Ludlow Street jail, the broken Tweed caught a cold and eventually died of bronchial pneumonia on April 12, 1878. The two Tammany bosses who succeeded Tweed, Honest John Kelly through 1886, immediately followed by Richard Croker, brought along their own versions of corruption which were different from Tweed's but no less damaging. Reverend Charles Parkhurst was a leader in the temperance movement and a longtime social reformer. Oliver Allen in New York, New York points out that Parkhurst's observations after a personal 3-week tour of the Tenderloin, an area of New York City where vice and corruption flourished, persuaded the state legislature in 1894 to initiate an inquiry. The Lexow Committee, designed to embarrass Democrats aligned with Tammany, launched a thorough investigation of Tammany's ties to New York vice and corruption. The committee unearthed evidence that the police were engaged in vice operations and were responsible for rigging elections and for police brutality. Another result of the Lexow Committee findings was the defeat of Tammany Hall in the 1894 municipal election. Sensing that the tides were turning against him, Croker resigned and sailed to England, where he stayed for 3 years. Tammany's grip had been loosened, but the change in regime was not complete, and some of the leaders to rise after Tweed's ouster also had ties to baseball. One was the corrupt police chief, William Big Bill Devery, whose motto was, "See, hear, and say nothing, eat, drink, and pay nothing." The Reform Police Commissioner in 1895, Teddy Roosevelt, vowed to nab a few upper echelon Tammany members, including Devery, but Roosevelt even had to fight members of his own party who were corrupted by the Tammany faction of the opposing party. He lasted only 1 year as commissioner. Devery eventually became instrumental in bringing an American League baseball team to New York. Van Johnson, American League president, had been denied a New York team for 2 years, but Devery would change that. Johnson had brought his Western League to Major League status on a par with the National League by offering a cleaner brand of baseball. By its second year of existence, the American League fielded teams in Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Washington. But Johnson felt that he desperately needed a New York team in order to survive. Tammany Hall, in control of the city's real estate, thwarted every attempt on the part of Van Johnson to establish a suitable site to erect a ballpark. In 1895, Andrew Friedman, a close friend of Tammany boss Croker, became owner of the New York Giants. As stated by Frank Graham in his book, The New York Giants, an informal history of a great baseball club, for 8 years, Friedman ruled the Giants and almost completely wrecked them. Had he not been restrained, he would have wrecked the league as well. Friedman and Croker worked together to block Johnson's efforts to plant an AL team in New York. But the unpopular Friedman irritated the other team owners when he attempted to syndicate the game into what would be known as the National League Trust. As Graham further reported, common stock would be used in payment for the 8 clubs, with New York to receive 30%, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Boston 12%, Philadelphia and Chicago 12%, Pittsburgh 8%, and Brooklyn 6%. Al Spalding, another father of baseball and an integral part of its early development, could not stand by and watch this travesty unfold. By way of an improperly held election in the spring of 1902, Spalding bluffed Friedman into thinking that his bold attempt to refashion baseball to fit his own needs had succeeded only in splitting the league wide open, and that further measures on his part were bound to fail. As a result of this, Friedman promised to resign as soon as he could find a suitable buyer. Meanwhile, another faction existed in Tammany Hall that was able to circumvent the efforts of Friedman to block Johnson in the AL. Devery and pool room king Frank Farrell were able to locate a rocky site for Johnson on Broadway between 165th Street and 168th Street. The ballpark on the site would become known as American League Park, or more commonly, Hilltop Park. Farrell and Devery became the first owners of the American League New York franchise that we now know as the New York Yankees. They purchased the Baltimore Orioles on January 9, 1903 for $18,000 and moved the team to New York City. George Ehret's Hellgate Brewery had the top-selling beer 1877 to 1888, with Jacob Ruppert Sr.'s Knickerbocker beer trailing just behind. After his son, Jacob Ruppert Jr., took over the running of the brewery, as reported by Glenn Stout in Yankee Century, Knickerbocker needed a little push to grab the top spot in the market. Ruppert the Younger joined Tammany, and his membership helped put him where he wanted to be, number one. Knickerbocker was poured in every Tammany-held bar in the city, and Ruppert eventually dominated the market. Tammany recognized Ruppert's rise by giving him a spot on the finance committee alongside Andrew Friedman, the man reviled by National League team owners. Ruppert was then tapped by Boss Croker to run for Congress in order to cultivate the much-needed and rising German vote. Ruppert followed the Tammany line while serving 4 terms, 1899 to 1907. Upon leaving Congress in 1907, Ruppert immersed himself in his brewery business. Stout claimed that he owned yachts, raced horses, bred dogs, and collected exotic animals, jade, porcelain, first editions, and mistresses. But he also had an interest in owning a baseball team, preferably the New York Giants. Giants manager John McGraw introduced Ruppert to civil engineer Captain Tillinghast Lamadou Houston, who made his fortune in the Spanish-American War and then in Cuba. But the Giants wouldn't be the team that Ruppert and Houston would acquire. By 1914, the Highlanders/Yankees had fallen lower and lower in the standings, and Devery and Farrell were experiencing growing tensions in both their business and personal relationships. They were bleeding money, basically through a lack of any business acumen. American League president Van Johnson, not wanting to see his New York franchise go under, set up a meeting with Farrell, Devery, Houston, and Ruppert to discuss the possibility of selling the franchise. A deal was consummated whereby Tammany Hall's Bill Devery and Frank Farrell would sell their interest in the New York Yankees to former Tammany Hall Congressman Jacob Ruppert and Cap Houston for the sum of $465,000, quite a windfall from the $18,000 that they had spent on their charter. By the late 1930s, the influence of Tammany was beginning to wane, and the society was officially disbanded in the 1960s. Jacob Ruppert, for his contributions to the game of baseball and the New York Yankees, was elected to the Hall of Fame in 2012. So put it all together, if you can, and you'll understand the following. Baseball began as a grassroots game during the Civil War. It had many minority players and was run by the players themselves, who, not unlike today's athletes, knew a lot more about getting hammered and having fun than running a business. With the help of the New York media as its propaganda arm, the Tammany Hall political machine, run by Boss Tweed, who was the manager of the New York City Mutuals, popularized the sport and connected it with the national zeitgeist with the sole purpose of increasing gambling on outcomes they secretly controlled. The only reason baseball is popular is because New York Democrats made it popular so you could lose money in a rigged system that preys on addiction. Baseball only became racially segregated because Democrats are racist. And though the Tammany Hall machine was ostensibly destroyed, its last public leader, Democrat Congressman Jacob Ruppert, remains enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame to this day. Money and racism. These were the driving forces behind the modern MLB as we know it. And these forces were wielded by Democrats and the mob.
You know, you might think about taking Jesus Christ as your savior instead of fooling around with all this stuff.
Shit, Harris.
Jesus. I like him very much. But he no help with curveball.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?
Okay, Harris, let's not start a holy war here.
Wouldn't leave it rum sitting around out here with this group.
He's very bad to steal Joe Boo's rum. He's very bad.
Up your butt, Joe Boo.
Yo, bartender! Joe Boo needs a refill! And watch it! Hustle, Boo! 2020 is going to be remembered Thank you. 2020 is going to be remembered as a baseball season like no other. Our clubs, and especially our players, were presented with an array of unique challenges.
MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred Jr. was born in 1958 in Rome, New York, near the Finger Lakes, a small town where 9 out of every 10 people is white Italian American, and where 10 out of 10 Rome natives own perhaps the single most racist and violent history of all early American settlements. Rome, New York was built on top of the Oneida Carrying Place, a Native American portage between the Mohawk River and Wood Creek, or more clearly, a Native American trade route that connected the Hudson River to Lake Ontario, or to the main point, and most clearly, the Oneida Carry was the only trade link between the East Coast and the continental interior, and it was controlled by Native Americans, so it was seized and fortified in 1796 and renamed Rome. The commissioner's father, Robert Sr., ran the Revere Copper Company, started by Paul Revere himself, which was the sole industry of Rome, New York for most of its existence, and thus Robert Sr. was hated by the poor residents of Rome, who naturally disliked the way the millionaire executive ruthlessly crushed their finances and futures in the name of corporate profits. Manfred's history with the sport of baseball also began with Robert Sr., who, outside of making a ton of money at the expense of wage slaves, had but a single documented hobby: taking upwards of 30 young boys to out-of-town baseball and basketball games without parental supervision and showering them with gifts of gourmet food in 5-star hotels. In a 2016 article from the Rome Sentinel, the late Joe Ryan remembers one such trip. Quote, "I was one of Bob's, Robert Sr.'s, assistant coaches and helped him take the athletes on the road in my Astro van. Back in 1993, Bob and I took 30 kids to Boston for a huge tournament. A nor'easter with 2 feet of snow stranded us in a hotel and we couldn't get home. Some of our players came without parents and we had to feed them. The hotel would put out special food, but it was expensive. I told Bob and he winked at me and said, 'I got this.' Nobody realized what he did that weekend but me. Then as I look back, he must have spent hundreds of dollars of his own money feeding those kids. Words can't tell you how special Bob was." Many of the boys that Bob took on those basketball weekends were from single-parent families, and some were from underprivileged families. Bob used to tell me that he took the best-behaved athletes, not the most talented ones. They were a reflection of his hometown, and Bob wanted Rome to be proud of the teams he assembled. I once asked him why he didn't ask a certain talented young 6th grader to travel with us to a tournament in Connecticut. He winked at me and said, "When we travel out of town, these kids represent Rome, New York, so I don't take the best players, but I take the best behaved. The boys he coached are all young men now, and most are raising children of their own." Ryan then lists names, ending with, "He touched each and every one." Robert Sr. must have been connected in some way because his son, the future MLB commissioner, was able to gain entry first to Cornell, then to Harvard, where Rob earned his Juris Doctorate. The copper magnate's son then joined a law firm in Washington, D.C. The commissioner's specific ancestry is vague. His oldest recorded relative is Peter Manfred of New York, circa 1820, before which no information is publicly available. Manfred is an extremely rare German surname, but Rob Jr., his father Rob Sr., and his entire lineage are Italian. Thus, in this case, it's almost certain Manfred was anglicized from the ultra-common Italian Manfredo, or Manfredi, meaning it's possible the commissioner is directly related to the Gambino crime family and possibly the very origin of the Italian Mafia. The connection is speculative at best and appears to be unprovable, but for what it's worth, the Manfredi family rose to prominence over 1,000 years ago as nobles of a region of northern Italy called Romagna, the Italian version of a Latin term that means the land where the Romans live, or territories subjected to Roman rule.
She's stuff now, Jobu. Look, I go to you. I stick up for you. You no help me now. So fuck you, Jobu. I do it myself.
Jackson wants a new sign. Now he's got what he likes. Here's the pitch to Serrano.
How many people do you think bet money on sports? How much money would you guess they bet on sports each year? According to LegalSportsBetting.com, which tracks major sportsbooks in Vegas and New Jersey, as well as FanDuel and DraftKings, which Major League Baseball partially owns, estimates that sports betting is a $150 billion industry every year. They call that a conservative estimate, and more shocking is that an estimated 50% of American adults have bet on sports in the past year, with the same 1 out of 2 currently living in states that will have legalized sports betting by the year 2024. But LegalSportsBetting.com clarifies its metric as just that, legal sports betting in the United States only. The truth is for real unbelievable. Quote, the sports betting industry is worth an estimated $3 trillion. Illegal betting makes up more than half of that. Asia and North America lead the pack for countries with the highest cases of illegal sports gambling. During this year's Super Bowl, for example, $6 billion was spent on betting. While 1 in 10 Americans placed bets on the outcome of the game, only 5% of the bets were done legally, as per USA Today. In total, more than $400 billion is spent on illegal sports bets. While most of the illegal betting occurs in countries where gambling is disallowed, unauthorized wagering is also common in countries with legal betting. Most illegal bookies attract players with higher value odds, something gamblers are always looking for. The 3 biggest sports leagues in the US, after the NFL, attract gambling money worth as much as $80 billion worldwide every year. The biggest bets are placed around major games like the World Series, NBA playoffs, or hockey finals. According to ESPN, nearly 90% of all sports bets in major US sports in 2017 end up as losses for players. In 2017, players only won $248.7 million out of $4.8 billion spent gambling on basketball, hockey, and baseball games. Still, losses aren't stopping avid gamers from gambling. More than $1.4 billion was spent on basketball and a further $1.1 billion on baseball in 2018. Both of these were record numbers in the US. Globally, betting on US sports is a much bigger industry than most people think. Almost every UK bookmaker supports American sports leagues and games. While the exact amount spent on these games is hard to compile, it's estimated to be worth more than $50 billion for the NBA, MLB, and the NHL. Can you see where this is going? Can you think of a recent controversy in Major League Baseball, and I'm not talking about moving the All Star Game, that fits in the framework of huge sports bets, mafia-style fixing, and media cover-ups? It should all sound familiar if you were properly educated, which you weren't, for a reason. Because in New York, and baseball itself, all roads lead back to Tammany Hall.
The way Commissioner Rob Manfred has handled the cheating scandal is mind-blowing. Manfred did not punish any of the Houston Astros players who illegally stole signs during the 2017 season. He's letting the Astros keep their championship trophy from 2017 when they defeated the Dodgers in the World Series, despite the fact that it may have been tainted by cheating. Turner is also seething over what Manfred said over the weekend when he called the championship trophy just a piece of metal. Manfred said it would be futile to ask the Astros to give it back.
What a disgrace that was. Just watching their apology yesterday too, there's no sincerity, there's no genuineness when it comes to it.
What are your thoughts on what the Astros did yesterday?
I thought the apologies were whatever. I thought Jim Crane's was weak. I thought Manfred's punishment was weak, giving him immunity. These guys were cheating for 3 years. I think what people don't realize is Altuve stole an MVP from Judge in 17. Everyone knows they stole the ring from us.
When you know the signs and you know what's coming, especially at this level of baseball, we have some of the most talented baseball players in the world, and as hitters, if they have an edge, an advantage, knowing what's coming, it's just going to make them stronger.
I think we were prepared going in there, and we heard things. We didn't know exactly what happened, but I don't know. It's a little frustrating when you look at it and you see kind of who they hurt and people that they hurt with the decisions that they did make. So. And it seems like it's not done yet, so we'll see what happens, what else comes out.
What happened, man. The situation sucks. I don't know. It's just, it's a little frustrating when you look at it and you see kind of who they hurt and people that they hurt with the decisions that they did make. So.
What happened happened, man. Like, the situation sucks. I don't know. It's
punishments were given. Players got immunity. They got away with it, and it is what it is, man.
When you see some of your former teammates today deny the use of any buzzer in 2019, do you accept that, completely believe that there was none of that going on?
Sure. I wouldn't have seen it or been privy to that information anyway, but I believe my ex-teammates. I believe those guys, so.
What's your take on all these apologies coming out of the Astros camp?
Yeah, you know, I saw it yesterday, and I knew I was going to get asked, and I was thinking about it a lot, and to be honest, I don't know. I don't know what to think anymore. You know, some of those guys seemed remorseful. Some of those guys said the right things, gave a good apology, and that's great. I'll move on with that. And then you get the owner up there saying some dumb stuff, and it's like, what? You know, it's like, what's going on? You know, it's just, how can you be that ignorant to the situation? So, I don't really know what to make of it all anymore. So I think, honestly, I just don't even know what to say about it. So,
how about your opinion on what effect it had on you guys?
It probably had an effect. I mean, without knowing for sure what's going on, you really have no idea. So, without like knowing exact specifics, how can I answer that question?
Do you want those specifics? What's that? Do you want those specifics?
It'd be awesome if you could know every pitch, that they knew something that was coming and which pitch and all that stuff. But you know what? It's not going to happen, and I'm okay with it. I've made peace with it. I'm moved on.
JD, are you embarrassed to be a part of that organization, to look back at that part of your life?
Yeah, you know, it's a fair question. You know, I think the not only the fans, want the game to be fair. I know you guys want it to be fair as well. You want to cover a game where it's fair to everybody, and again to the peers as well, and of course everybody that's part of the 2017 Astros, it's they feel regrettable about that decision, and looking back, as a young guy, being exposed to that in 2017 and looking back now and getting a full season under my belt, of course it's regrettable. And
angry are you at the sign stealing scandal? Angry, I don't know if is the right word. That was a tough World Series to swallow. You lose Game 7. Something that I said afterwards that we'll never get over. But the more and more stuff that comes out, it just kind of rehashes those emotions.
$2017. It's like, I'm pretty sure it was going on 2018, 2019 too. Like, and that's just so sad, because it's like, just because if they didn't get caught, they'd still be doing it.
The reason that you wanted to do that in the first place is because all the people that own media companies that own baseball teams are the ones that voted you in as commissioner in the first place. So you're protecting them.
Holy fucking shit, this fucking timeline is lit. All over, it's over. World's biggest Alex Joner. Holy fucking cow, this fucking timeline is all over, it's over. World's biggest Alex Joner.
All of my sexual fantasies involve handcuffs.